Dear brothers and sisters, tonight we come to the final companion from the Abdullah that we are covering. As I mentioned early on, that doesn't mean that we won't cover another companion named Abdullah, but he is the fourth of these four young companions around the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that practically documented the religion for us. And I want you to just appreciate for a moment that last week we talked about, and we said that the largely persevered because of the initial efforts of the person that we're talking about today, is the companion who wrote down and documented hundreds of a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that were absorbed into the corpus of what we have of the Sunnah today. So this is another one of those companions who gets lost. And it's really interesting because if you're reading many of the translations, what I've noticed is that he often gets mixed up with Abdullah Omar because in Arabic, the name can be spelled the same. So they'll add the waw Abdullah, right, just to distinguish him from Abdullah bin. So a lot of times if you're reading English literature, they'll say Abdullah bin, and they mean Abdullah bin. So he's another one of those companions that's kind of in the background, but that has an outsized contribution to Islamic history and to Islamic literature, and to many of the most famous hadith that we have today. And so we start off with Da'a, says the Imam, the scholar, the worshipper, the companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the son of his companion Abu Muhammad. So his son's name is Muhammad Abda. Very interesting. So he's Abu Muhammad, and as Saistman that some of the historians wrote down his name as Abu Abdman or Abu N. So his relationship with his father, Amr ibn al-Azra, before we talk about him just briefly, let's kind of talk about what's relevant to what happened with his father, and I want you to go back and watch the entire lecture about his father, inshallah, if you want to gain some of that context. His father, and of course his grandfather, his uncle, but there's a whole history that he's coming out of, and his father, of course, is one of the great companions who was one of the great enemies of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was such a thorn in the side of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, such an annoyance that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam at one point made dua against him, right? I mean, he is persecuting the Muslims in Mecca, he's chasing them to Abel out of, then he's fighting them in Medina, and he's plotting against them here, and he's plotting against them there, and he's trying to cut off the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's communications with anyone to the outside. And at some point the Prophet made dua against him, and Allah revealed the verse in that it is not for you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the final decision as to whether they should be cut off or forgiven or punished. Indeed, they are transgressors. So Allah establishes that they are, but at the same time it is not for you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to declare the final judgment on them until they die, and so he's one of those people standing on the other side of the Prophet, on who Allah guides, and Allah guides the children as well, and who becomes one of the greatest reasons for the spread of Islam. And this is something deeply important, that every one of these major enemies of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, either Allah guided them, or Allah guided their children, or both, and they actually became a means for the spread of Islam. So, in the case of him and his son, that will become outsized in terms of their contribution to Islam, of course, is the one who opened Egypt, he set up much of the conquest of, as a whole, set the arena for the entrance of along with, and other companions, right? So this is an outsized family in terms of the contributions that they have to Islamic history. But the point is about Abdullah, the Prophet was taught to always have hope in the kids, right? So even if himself would not have been guided just like with their children, might be different, and what an incredible human being Abdullah bin was going to become, and of course in that sense, right, he's the only one whose father was an enemy of Islam for a very long time, right? I mean, is the disciple of the Prophet, right? Yes, early on enemy, but converts very early on, and becomes who he becomes throughout of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam Abbas. Even when he was concealing his Islam, he's always an ally to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is the only one of the four that's growing up in a household that's fighting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right, and then has to make that switch at some point in his life, All right. Now, I'm going to give you like one of those moments in Islamic history right now that's going to make you go, huh? Like, really, are you sure? We got some 11-year-old boys in here. All right, don't worry. I'm not kicking them out of the masjid. I'm just calling your attention to something. Says that Abdullah was born when was 11. Pay attention. Some of the writers say was 11. Some of them say he was 12. The mother of Abdullah or was 9, all right. Some writers say was 10 when Abdullah was born, which just goes to show you that they were made different back then. So if you see an 11-year-old right now walking around or a 12-year-old, that's when he had Abdullah, right? Does it make sense in our modern day? Absolutely not, right? But I'm not talking about like one odd narration that says he was like, 11 or 12. I'm talking about every single writer puts him between 10 or 13, with a Dahabi putting him at 11. So he's practically his dad's brother, right? Which makes him very different in the sense that when he, grows up with his father, he's kind of growing up as a sidekick. He's not a young child. He embarks on everything his father embarks on. He's his father's right-hand man. I can see some of you are still like, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. I didn't misread the Arabic. Go back and read all of the sources of that's the age, right? Which is one of, by the way, the main things that you push back on, like when people bring up the age of the mocker back. Then, was puberty right? Was when they hit the age of maturity they got married. And some of them had kids very, very early on this's bed. When life 1,500 years ago, right, like this is. What it is okay, so the point is not to give you like a biological frame of reference as much to give you a context to Abdullah and his father. They are companions of one another, as well they speak to each other as belonging somewhat to the same generation, and so you're going to see the way that relationship is going to flourish. Abdullah is participating in everything his father does, and there isn't much between him and his father. And when he embraces Islam in Al-Medina, of course, later on, he is already a grown man, so he's also not the age of Abdul Abbas or Abdul Omar, who was slightly older, or of course Abdul Zubair was much younger. He's not that age, right? He's coming into Islam into his late 20s, close to the age of his father. May Allah be pleased with them, the irony of his original name, something else very interesting about him. Subhan Allah, and this is a connection, even though I've talked about him before, I only thought about along this time, his name, his birth name was not Abdullah, his birth name was Al. Does anyone know what Al means? What it means, what does mean, right? Someone who's disobedient, stubborn, arrogant. It carries horrible names, horrible meanings, but alas was the name of his father, so he named his oldest son after his father. Right, and subhanallah, there are two things here that are so interesting. One of them is that Al and Abdullah could not be, more different in terms of the personalities and in terms of their trajectories. If you go back, subhanallah, Al is one of those people who's in every negative of the Quran, meaning what? Every ayah that condemns the hypocrites and the disbelievers, it's either talking about Orb, or it's talking about, or the father of Al is always there. Some of the scholars say he's the most condemned person in the Quran, the most condemned person of the Quran, mock the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in multiple ways. Some of them say is right, like just even the surahs you read in right, the person who belied the religion, who condemned the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who put so much in his path to try to stop him, and the one subhanallah who said about the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, leave him, because he is cut off, he has no sons when he dies, when Muhammad dies, no one will remember him, subhanallah, right, came down as a response to now, here's the connection I want you to pay attention to. Al mocked the Prophet and said, when he dies, no one will remember him because he has no sons. Instead, the boy that was named after him, his grandson became the first one to document and write down the hadiths of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam by the hundreds and memorize over 1,000 hadiths of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and extend them to where they're absorbed into Al-Qari and Muslim and so on so forth, right? How Allah flipped it on him like he would have never thought that 1,500 years later we'd be talking about the man who we said, oh, no one will remember him because he has no sons because of his son his grandson that was named after him partly because of him extending the dimension of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So that's the first thing, like no two people could be further apart. The second thing is that one of the most prominent descriptions of he was obedient to his father. Super obedient to a flaw, as you will see, right? Like obedience was his thing. He was submissive. He was obedient. He followed his father. He adored his father, right? So he's the opposite of Al. So when he came to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam changed his name to Abdullah. So he's one of those who was named Abdullah by the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. One of the most beloved names to Allah as opposed to Al. Something also very interesting Abdullah ibn Amr Ra''s parents' upbringing and coming to Islam about him is that he embraced Islam before both of his parents by 1 year. How the details were we don't know, but it's well documented that he came to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam perhaps in private right, but he embraced Islam a year before his father and his mother. So he's not counted amongst those who embraced Islam at the fat. He's someone who came well before, or at least significantly enough before, to where it's documented that he came to the Prophet and embraced Islam. So this kind of shows you the leaning that he already had towards al-Islam, and the Prophet he praised Abdullah, and he praised his parents. He said Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that what a blessed household it is Abda, and his father Abu Abda being, and his mother Abda, who is may Allah be pleased with them all. So how did he come to Islam? We don't know, but let's remember that his uncle Hisham was one of the earliest Muslims. His uncle Hisham was actually was persecuting the Muslims in Abisa. He was actually one of the early Muslims who fled to Abbas, and there could be a connection there, and Abdullah actually named one of his children after him. So there could be a relationship there that perhaps piqued his interest into Islam early on. Now, his upbringing, subhanallah, is the opposite of the other three as well. In what sense? He was raised with arrogance. He was raised with luxury. He was raised to be the leader of his tribe. He's the natural successor, okay, and while his father is from the most intelligent and clever of the Arabs, and he inherited that intelligence, he also inherited the pompous nature of what came with that family. And this is sort of his talking about how he struggled through that when he met the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. What does that mean? He grew up very spoiled and was being fed a lot of tribal nonsense about how superior you are to everybody else because of your tribe. Right? And I mention here, subhanallah, one of his brothers, remember even after Islam. This is a very famous story that one of Umar Ra had Abdullah's brother punished to humble him. His brothers was racing a horse, racing with a Coptic Christian in the of the Coptic Christian, right? He was a Coptic slave, he beat him in the race, so he got so upset and offended the brother that he went to him and he whipped him across the face, and he said, "You know, how dare you do this to me? I am the son of the nobles." And that man came and complained so said, "You come here, mister son of the nobles," and he called as well, and he told this Christian Coptic slave, right, said, "Take the whip and put it." He said, "First of all, take your revenge." And then he said, as for put the whip on top of his head, to just remind him, because he said he didn't do anything to me. He said, "No, but it was in his name that you were degraded, right, like Omar is setting a standard in society, like we don't play those games in Islam. We should not have this type of tribalism, and this type of supremacy and superiority. All of that goes away with Islam. So that's just to show you the type of environment that he grows up in. And so as explains, he was tall, he had a reddish complexion, and he says he had a big stomach. Now when he says that what he's referring to is, he grew up in luxury like they ate well. So you can imagine the spoiled kid that grew up in in a lap of luxury, and while the persecution is taking place and things that sort like he's someone that had a lot of money, He had a lot of food, he had a lot of wealth, he had a lot of clothes. In fact, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he became Muslim, he said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw me dressed in 2 saffron-colored garments, these really fancy clothes, and he said to me, "Did your mother command you to wear these?" And I said, "Yeah, should I wash them out?" And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "It's better that you set them on fire, like burn them. These are not clothes to be worn by a young man in Islam." So he had a certain type of garment. He had a certain type of lifestyle, and that was very hurtful to him. And by the way, another narration is that these are the garments of the kufr, so do not wear them. So maybe it was something specific to the disbelievers that he was wearing that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said do away with altogether. So he explains this like I came into Islam and I had a lot to unlearn. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told me about effort. He told me about, he's teaching me by integrating me into the community about like equality and things of that we did not learn in my context. So, here's the whole story of Abdullah, if you could summarize it. The man that's trying to catch up, and he is in every book that talks about quote-unquote extremism. Extremism, not he memorized everything that had been revealed of Quran in 1 year in the meaning of violence, but in going too far with the religion too quickly, like someone that tries to go overzealous and get the whole religion too quickly, both in terms of knowledge as well as practice. He comes into Medina, he's like, I need to catch up. I see all these other people that are my age, and this is where they are, all these Sahaba. I have to go. So what does he do? The first thing, and not all of this is condemn to be condemned. In fact, some of it is very praiseworthy. He memorized the Quran in the first year of being a Muslim, so he became in the first year very, very tough. Not all of the Sahaba were, by the way. It was a small group of them. He memorized the Quran. Second thing I'm talking about outside of his connection to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which I'll get to, he noted who the most knowledgeable of the companions were, and he immediately sat at their feet and tried to get everything that he missed. So he narrates from the family of the Prophet, and he says, Subhan Allah, and this is in Beek. Ari, he says that the most beloved person to me was Abda, is the best, so much so remember that if you just Sita without anything in a chain of narration, it means Abda, so he says I loved him right, and I'll never stop loving him. I heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say take the Quran from 4 people, and the first person that he mentioned was Abdullah bin. So he dedicated himself to Abda Mas, right? Learning the Quran from him, learning the explanation of the Quran, trying to shed his ways. And then he says, so he memorized the book of Allah. Mind you, this is only in the last 3 years of Islam, right? He says, I memorized 1,000 parables from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now this is not the incredible thing here, the memorization of a hadith, because many of the companions memorized a hadith, but it was something else, and Abdullah ibn Amr Ra compiled the first book of hadith, that is, that he said to the Prophet, Ya, I hear from you things that I love to preserve. He said, I want to support my heart with my hand like I'm memorizing it, but I want to write it down as well. So can I write down what you say? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said yes, all right. Now the context here is that initially the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not want the companions to write down what he was saying, so that they don't mix it up with the Quran as it was being compiled. Once that fear is gone, then the preservation of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's words, even through writing, is something that he permits sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is such an important principle in Islam that you hold on to that transcends the individual that we're talking about today. Abda says that I used to write down everything that I heard from the Messenger of Allah. So imagine you have a person writing down a hadith of the Prophet. He's sitting down in all of the dust of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his hand is constantly moving. So he says that some of the Qur'an said to me, do you write down everything that the Prophet ﷺ says, write, like despite emotions, despite times? And you know at the same time the Prophet ﷺ is a human being. You don't have to write down everything he says. So he said, so I stopped writing. Then I said to the Prophet ﷺ that some of Quraysh told me not to write down what you say, or that I shouldn't write down what you okay. So he said that the Prophet ﷺ pointed to his mouth, and he said, write, because I swear by the one in whose hand is my soul, nothing comes out of this mouth except for the truth. So write. So again, this is now at a period of Islam where there is no fear of mixing up a hadith of the Prophet with the Quran. Islam is well established. The Quran is memorized now across the board by multiple people. And preserving the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ also is a priority, and he says that there is no one from the companions of the Prophet who narrated more from him than I except for. So he says the difference between me and that he used to write down everything, and I didn't used to write down. So this is Abu talking, and multiple narrations in this regard. He says that we were with the Prophet, and we were writing down what he says. I say this before I get into this to say that subhanallah as time goes on, and you will always find this fitna of in Sunnah, and questioning the Sunnah, and questioning the authority of the Sunnah, and questioning the preservation of hadith. It shows its head all the time, and when we talk about the fitn that are around us, this is a fitna as well that hold on to the Sunnah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, hold on to what was so preserved. Don't let these Western academics that will come up with all sorts of a historical revision to try to take you off of what has been given to you by these most noble people, and I'll talk about this inshallah. So what was it called? So listen very carefully as you see walking around with a book. It was called, which means the truthful tablet. The truthful tablet is the truthful book. He had over 700 had that he wrote sitting with the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. 700 sayings that he actually wrote down with the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He used to hold on to it. He used to keep it with him. And you even find this is authentically narrated in Ahmed, and as well as others that says we are with Abda, and we asked him which of the two cities will be conquered first. Will it be Constantinople or will it be Rome? So he says that Abda said, hold on, and he brought a box, and it was locked. He unlocked the box. He took the book out, and he started to read. We were sitting with the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam when someone asked him which will be conquered first, the city of or Constantinople, and he, I'm sorry, the city of Rome or Constantinople, and he replied, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Constantinople, right? So this was actually something that was documented, and he had a hadith that was written down when he was sitting with the Prophet that he could bring up as soon as he would be asked, so he walks around with. And if you're reading, you see the name of Muja. A lot said I was once sitting with, and I saw that tablet, and I put my hand to it right to pick it up. And Abdu went literally like sometimes you have to